Hello everyone. Tonight we travel back to a quiet medieval village where something unusual happened every evening. Long before darkness even arrived, villagers rushed home and locked their doors tightly. Not at midnight, not even after sunset, but before the sun disappeared. Why were they so afraid of the night? What dangers waited outside those wooden doors once darkness fell? In this calm journey through history, we'll slowly explore the hidden reasons medieval villagers feared the night, and the strange realities of life after sunset that most people today have completely forgotten. So relax, settle in, and let the quiet stories of the medieval world gently guide you into sleep. As the sun slowly sank behind the forests, hills and scattered farmlands of medieval Europe, a quiet but urgent routine unfolded in villages across the countryside. People began hurrying back to their cottages. Animals were gathered into pens, and heavy wooden doors were pulled shut and secured with bars, bolts, or simple iron latches. For medieval villagers, locking the door before sunset was not merely a habit of caution. It was a deeply ingrained survival practice shaped by the dangers of the outside world. Night in the medieval period was not the gentle, illuminated darkness we know today. Without streetlights, electricity, or modern policing, the countryside became a place of deep shadows and uncertainty. Once the sun disappeared, the darkness was thick and almost complete, broken only by faint moonlight, scattered torches, or the glow of fireplaces inside homes. Beyond the small circle of light from a hearth or candle lay a world that could easily conceal threats, and villagers knew that once night arrived, help would be far away and danger could approach silently. The first and most immediate reason villagers secured their doors before sunset was the presence of bandits and thieves who roamed the countryside. Medieval roads were dangerous even during the day, but at night they became ideal hiding grounds for criminals who preyed on isolated farms and small communities. Many villages were located far from castles or major towns, and the nearest authority figure might be miles away. This meant that if criminals decided to target a house after dark, the family inside had little chance of receiving help. Bandits often traveled in small groups, watching villages during daylight hours and waiting for night to fall before approaching quietly. They knew that villagers kept food stores, livestock, tools, and sometimes coins inside their homes. For a struggling bandit, stealing a sack of grain or a few chickens could mean survival for another week. Because of this constant threat, villagers developed the habit of securing their homes early, making it clear that the household was protected and alert. Another reason for locking doors before sunset was the presence of wild animals that still roamed large parts of medieval Europe. Dense forests surrounded many villages, and animals such as wolves, boars, and sometimes even bears could wander dangerously close to human settlements. Livestock attracted predators, and the smell of animals kept in barns or near houses could bring hungry creatures out of the forest. Wolves were particularly feared during winter months when food became scarce. Packs sometimes approached villages, searching for sheep, goats, or even scraps of food thrown outside homes. Although attacks on humans were relatively rare, the possibility was enough to keep villagers cautious. Closing doors and securing animals before darkness helped prevent predators from entering homes or barns. The structure of medieval houses also made early security necessary. Most homes were built from wood, wattle and daub, or rough stone, with simple doors that could be forced open if someone tried hard enough. Locks were basic and often consisted of wooden bars placed across the inside of the door. Because these houses were not strongly fortified, the best defense villagers had was preparation and vigilance. Families would gather indoors while there was still some daylight, ensuring that doors were shut firmly and any openings were covered. Windows were small and often had wooden shutters that were closed at night to keep both cold air and unwanted visitors outside. In many homes, the door was the only large opening connecting the household to the outside world, so securing it became the most important step before nightfall. Medieval villagers also feared the unknown aspects of night itself. The medieval world was deeply influenced by superstition, folklore, and religious belief, and darkness was often associated with spirits, demons, and wandering forces beyond human understanding. Stories passed down through generations warned people not to wander outside after sunset. Many believed that malevolent spirits or supernatural beings were more active during the night. While some of these fears were rooted in imagination and tradition, they served an important social purpose, encouraging people to remain indoors where they were safer. Locking the door symbolized the boundary between the protected domestic space and the unpredictable world outside. Another important factor was the absence of organized law enforcement in most rural areas. Medieval villages did not have police patrols or night watch systems like modern cities. Although some larger towns employed watchmen to guard the streets after dark, smaller villages relied mostly on community cooperation and individual caution. If a suspicious stranger approached a house at night, the family inside had to defend themselves. Weapons such as farming tools, wooden staffs, or small knives were sometimes kept near the door for this reason. Locking the door early allowed villagers to create a sense of security within their homes, knowing that any potential intruder would have to make noise or force entry, giving the household time to react. The timing of sunset itself played an important role in daily life. Without modern clocks, villagers organized their routines according to natural light. Work in the fields ended when the sun began to fall, and families returned home soon afterward. Cooking, repairing tools, and preparing food for the next day were usually done while there was still some light from the sky. Once darkness arrived, activities slowed dramatically because candles and oil lamps were expensive and produced limited light. This meant that most people went to bed relatively early. Locking the door before sunset ensured that the household was prepared for the quiet hours of night when everyone would be resting. Livestock protection was another critical concern. Animals represented wealth and survival for medieval families. A single cow could provide milk, manure, and future calves, while chickens produced eggs and meat. Losing animals to theft or predators could push a family into serious hardship. Many villagers kept small animals close to the house or even inside certain sections of the home during the night. This practice meant that doors needed to remain securely closed to prevent animals from wandering out and predators from entering. The smell and sound of livestock could easily attract unwanted attention, making strong nighttime security essential. Seasonal conditions also influenced the habit of locking doors early. During autumn and winter, darkness arrived much earlier, and the long nights increased the sense of vulnerability. Cold winds swept across open fields, and people preferred to stay inside near the warmth of the hearth. The earlier sunset also meant that travellers who had not reached their destination before dark sometimes knocked on village doors seeking shelter. While hospitality was valued in medieval culture, villagers were cautious about admitting strangers at night because they could not easily judge a person's intentions. A traveller might be honest, but there was always the risk that he could be scouting for valuables or planning a theft. Because of this uncertainty, families often chose to keep doors closed and avoid contact with unknown visitors after sunset. The social structure of villages further reinforced the importance of nighttime security. Most communities were small, with populations ranging from a few dozen to a few hundred people. Everyone generally knew one another, and unfamiliar faces were quickly noticed. When night fell, any movement outside could seem suspicious. If villagers heard footsteps or voices beyond the door after dark, it immediately raised concern. By locking doors early, households established a clear boundary that discouraged wandering strangers and reinforced the expectation that nighttime belonged to rest and safety indoors. Fire hazards also played a role in evening routines. Medieval homes relied on open hearths for cooking and warmth, and these fires could easily spread if not carefully managed. Before going to bed, families often reduced the fire to glowing embers and ensured that sparks would not ignite nearby straw or wooden beams. Once this was done, the house would become quieter and darker, making it even more important that doors remained closed to prevent wind from fanning flames or animals from entering. A secure door helped maintain a controlled indoor environment throughout the night. Over time, the practice of locking doors before sunset became part of village culture and tradition. Parents taught children from a young age about the importance of returning home before dark. Church bells sometimes rang in the evening to signal the end of daily work and remind villagers that nighttime was approaching. The sound of a bell echoing across fields often marked the moment when people finished their tasks and hurried back to their homes. Soon afterward, doors would close one by one, creating a quiet village where only faint light escaped through small shutters. Despite these precautions, nights in medieval villages were not always completely silent. Dogs barked occasionally at distant sounds, owls called from nearby trees, and wind rustled through thatched roofs. Inside the homes, families sat around the hearth, telling stories, mending clothes, or saying evening prayers before going to sleep. The locked door behind them provided a sense of comfort, a simple but meaningful barrier between their small world and the unknown darkness beyond it. In many ways, the habit of locking doors before sunset reflected the broader realities of medieval life. People lived closely connected to nature, dependent on the land for survival and aware that danger could arise from many directions. As the final light of the sun faded across medieval fields and the long shadows of barns and cottages stretched across narrow dirt paths, the quiet ritual of securing the household became even more deliberate. Villagers did not wait for full darkness before protecting their homes. They acted while the last traces of daylight still allowed them to see clearly and finish their tasks. This early preparation was important because once night truly arrived, the countryside could become almost impossible to navigate. Medieval villages had no street lamps, and moonlight was often hidden by clouds or forest canopies. A person stepping outside after dark could quickly lose direction, stumble into ditches, or wander toward the edges of nearby woods where dangers might be waiting. Because of this, families preferred to finish all outdoor work before sunset and close themselves safely inside their homes. The design of many villages also influenced this habit. Homes were often clustered together along narrow paths or around a central well or church. But beyond this small circle lay farmland, open meadows and thick forest. These landscapes created natural hiding places where strangers or animals could move unseen once the light faded. During the day, villagers working in fields could easily spot travelers approaching from a distance. But at night, the same paths could conceal movement until someone was already close to a house. Locking doors before sunset allowed villagers to remove that vulnerability before darkness made it impossible to monitor the surroundings. Fear of fire, surprisingly, was another subtle reason people closed their homes early. Medieval villages were extremely vulnerable to accidental fires because many houses were built with wooden frames and thatched roofs made from dried straw or reeds. A single spark carried by the wind could ignite an entire roof, and once a blaze began, it could spread rapidly from one house to another. During the evening, when cooking fires were still active and candles were being lit inside homes, villagers became cautious about airflow and drafts. By closing shutters and doors, they reduced the chance that wind might blow sparks outward or carry flames unpredictably through the village. In this way, locking the door was not only protection from outside threats, but also a method of controlling the environment inside the home. Another important aspect of nighttime safety involved the way medieval people stored their food. Many households kept sacks of grain, smoked meats, dried herbs, and preserved vegetables inside their cottages or small storage rooms attached to the house. These supplies were meant to last through harsh winters or poor harvests, making them extremely valuable. A thief who managed to steal even a small portion could cause serious hardship for a family. Because food was stored so close to living spaces, villagers treated their homes almost like miniature fortresses during the night. Closing doors early ensured that no one could quietly slip inside while the family slept. The psychological comfort of a closed door also mattered deeply to medieval people. Life during that era was filled with uncertainties, crop failures, disease, war between neighboring lords, and sudden storms could disrupt the stability of a village at any time. In such a world, small routines offered reassurance and control. The act of shutting and securing the door each evening became a symbolic moment when the family gathered together in safety. Once the door was barred, the outside world, full of unpredictable events, was temporarily held at a distance. Inside, the warmth of the hearth, the smell of cooking food, and the presence of loved ones created a protected space that felt separate from the dangers beyond the walls. Children were taught early to respect this boundary between day and night. Parents warned them not to linger outdoors once the sun began to sink, reminding them that the village changed character after dark. While daylight hours were filled with movement, farming, and social interaction, nighttime belonged to quiet and caution. A child who stayed outside too long might face scolding or punishment, not out of strict discipline alone, but because parents genuinely feared what could happen in the darkness. This upbringing helped reinforce the communal habit of returning home before sunset and securing the household together. Weather also influenced how villagers approached nighttime security. During windy evenings, loose objects could be blown across the ground, creating strange sounds that might be mistaken for approaching footsteps. Heavy rain could make it difficult to hear movement outside, increasing anxiety about unseen visitors. By locking doors early, families avoided the stress of repeatedly checking outside during the night. They could focus instead on staying warm and dry while storms passed over the village. Another interesting reason for closing doors before sunset was the relationship between villages and travellers. Roads in the medieval world were not always safe or well maintained, and travellers often depended on reaching an inn or friendly settlement before darkness. However, once night approached, villagers became cautious about welcoming unknown people. While hospitality was an important cultural value, it also carried risks. A traveller might claim to need shelter but could secretly be scouting for valuables or planning to rob the household. For this reason, many families avoided answering the door once it was secured for the night. Anyone arriving late was usually directed toward an inn or monastery if one existed nearby. Monasteries sometimes played a special role in offering nighttime refuge. Monks living in religious communities often provided shelter to travellers who arrived after sunset. This arrangement helped relieve villages from the pressure of hosting strangers during the night. Still, the existence of such places reinforced the understanding that ordinary households were not meant to receive visitors after dark. The locked door signalled that the family had entered its private evening hours, and that the household was no longer open to outside contact. Sound carried differently at night in the medieval countryside, making villagers particularly alert to unusual noises. Without the constant hum of machines or traffic that modern societies experience, the nighttime environment was remarkably quiet. This silence meant that even small disturbances could stand out clearly. A snapping twig, a distant howl, or the creak of footsteps on dry ground could trigger alarm. Villagers often listened carefully from inside their homes, trying to identify whether sounds came from animals, neighbours, or something more suspicious. Knowing the door was firmly secured allowed them to observe these sounds calmly rather than with panic. Village dogs played an important role in this nighttime awareness. Many households kept dogs that acted as informal guardians, barking if they sensed movement nearby. The presence of barking dogs could discourage thieves from approaching too closely. However, the effectiveness of dogs depended on the door being closed and the household remaining alert. A locked door combined with the warning bark of a dog created a strong deterrent for anyone considering entering the property after dark. Religious belief also shaped the rhythm of evening life. Many families ended their day with prayer, asking for protection during the night, and giving thanks for surviving another day. The act of closing the door often came just before or just after these prayers. In this sense, the door represented not only physical protection, but also spiritual security. Medieval people believed that divine protection worked together with practical precautions, and a well-secured home was seen as part of living wisely under God's care. Seasonal festivals and gatherings sometimes extended village activity slightly into the evening. But even during celebrations, people remained mindful of the coming darkness. Once festivities ended, the village quickly returned to its normal pattern of quiet households and closed doors. The communal understanding that nighttime was a period of rest and caution remained deeply respected. In larger villages or towns that had defensive walls, gates were sometimes closed at sunset as well. These gates controlled who could enter or leave the settlement during the night. While small rural villages rarely had such fortifications, the idea of closing gates at sunset reflected the same principle practiced by individual households. The entire community recognized that darkness changed the balance between safety and vulnerability, and preparing for that change was essential. Inside their homes, villagers adapted their activities to the limited light available. Candles made from beeswax or animal fat were precious and often used sparingly. Families might share a single candle, while finishing simple tasks such as sewing, sharpening tools, or preparing food for the next day. Once these activities were done, people usually went to sleep earlier than modern individuals, conserving energy for the next day's labor. The locked door allowed them to rest without constantly worrying about disturbances from outside. Throughout the long centuries of the medieval period, these evening routines remained remarkably consistent. Though technology, politics, and kingdoms changed over time, the fundamental experience of rural life stayed similar for generations. The cycle of daylight work and nighttime security shaped the daily rhythm of millions of villagers. Each evening, as the sun disappeared beyond fields and forests, doors closed across the countryside in a quiet but powerful expression of caution and community wisdom. In the stillness that followed, only faint lights glowed through shuttered windows while the village settled into sleep. As twilight deepened across the medieval countryside, the sense of urgency that villagers felt about securing their homes became even stronger. The fading light marked a transition not only in the environment, but also in the behavior of the community itself. During the day, villages were lively places filled with movement. Farmers working fields, children running along dusty paths, merchants travelling between settlements, and neighbours gathering near wells or small marketplaces. But as the sun began to disappear behind hills or forests, that activity gradually slowed and then almost completely vanished. People understood that once darkness arrived, the outside world changed in ways that made everyday life far more unpredictable. One reason villagers acted early was because medieval darkness was far deeper than modern people can easily imagine. Today, even rural areas are illuminated by distant city lights, passing vehicles, or electronic devices. In contrast, medieval nights were almost entirely black. If the moon was hidden behind clouds, a person standing outside might not even be able to see their own hands clearly. Paths that were easy to walk during daylight became confusing and dangerous, especially in villages surrounded by fields and woods. A small mistake, stepping off the path or stumbling into a ditch, could result in injury. Because of this, villagers preferred to finish all outdoor activities before sunset and retreat indoors while they could still see their surroundings. Another reason for locking doors before sunset was the unpredictability of human behavior during times of hardship. Medieval life was often difficult, and many people lived close to the edge of survival. A failed harvest, a harsh winter, or a period of war could leave travellers desperate for food or shelter. While many wandering individuals were harmless, villagers had learned through experience that desperation could drive people to theft or violence. Someone who appeared friendly during the day might become a threat once darkness made identification difficult. By securing their homes early, villagers reduced the chance that such individuals could approach unnoticed or attempt to enter while the family was unprepared. Communication between villages was also slow, which increased uncertainty about events happening beyond the local area. News of bandits, escaped prisoners, or small groups of soldiers sometimes travelled by word of mouth, arriving days after the events had already occurred. Because information moved so slowly, villagers often preferred to assume the worst and remain cautious. Locking doors before sunset became part of this defensive mindset. Even if there was no immediate danger, the habit ensured that families were protected if trouble happened to pass through the region unexpectedly. The environment surrounding medieval villages also contributed to this routine. Many settlements were built near forests because wood was needed for fuel, tools, and building materials. However, forests also provided hiding places, not only for animals, but for people wishing to remain unseen. Travelers, hunters, and sometimes criminals moved through wooded areas where visibility was limited. At night, these forests became even more mysterious, filled with unfamiliar sounds such as rustling leaves, snapping branches, or distant animal calls. The proximity of such landscapes made villagers uneasy about leaving their homes open once darkness approached. Inside the home, evening routines often revolved around preparing for the next day. Families might grind grain, repair farming tools, spin wool into thread, or patch clothing that had worn out during the day's work. These tasks required concentration and were usually done near the hearth where the light was strongest. With the door closed and secured, the household could focus on these activities without worrying about unexpected interruptions. The locked door created a boundary that allowed the family to shift from the public life of the village to the private life of the home. Even sound patterns played a role in shaping villagers' caution. During daylight hours, the noise of work, hammering, animals moving, carts rolling along roads created a constant background of familiar sounds. But once evening came, those noises faded, leaving an eerie quiet. In this silence, even small disturbances seemed significant. The creak of wood outside a house or the movement of footsteps on dry leaves could easily alarm the people inside. Because they knew such sounds would stand out so clearly, villagers preferred to close their doors early and avoid unnecessary anxiety during the night. Livestock management further reinforced the practice of securing homes before sunset. Many animals needed to be brought into enclosures or barns before darkness. Sheep and goats were especially vulnerable to predators, while chickens had to be placed in coops to keep them safe. Farmers usually completed these tasks just before the sun set, ensuring that all animals were accounted for and protected. Once this work was finished, there was little reason to remain outside. The household could then focus on closing the door and settling in for the evening. Another aspect of medieval life that encouraged early door locking was the absence of reliable nighttime travel. Unlike modern roads with signs and lighting, medieval routes were often narrow tracks winding through fields and forests. These paths could easily become confusing in darkness. Travellers who attempted to move at night risked getting lost or injured. As a result, most people planned their journeys carefully so they could reach a settlement before sunset. If someone appeared at a village door after dark, it was unusual enough to make residents suspicious, which further encouraged families to keep their homes securely closed. Village communities also relied heavily on reputation and familiarity. Because most residents had known each other for years, they could recognize neighbors easily during the day. But at night, that recognition became much harder. A person standing outside a house might be difficult to identify in the dim glow of a candle or torch. This uncertainty meant that villagers often chose not to open their doors unless they were absolutely sure who was outside. Locking the door early prevented situations where families might feel pressured to respond to unknown visitors. For many villagers, evening security was also connected to the rhythm of agricultural life. Farming required waking before sunrise, especially during busy seasons like planting or harvesting. After a long day of physical labor, people were usually tired and ready to sleep soon after darkness fell. Locking the door before sunset ensured that once the household went to bed, no one would need to get up repeatedly to check outside. The family could rest peacefully knowing that the home was already secured. Weather conditions could also amplify the sense of danger at night. Strong winds sometimes caused tree branches to scrape against walls or roofs, creating strange noises that sounded like movement. Rainstorms could flood paths and make it difficult to hear what was happening outside. During winter, snow might cover the ground and hide tracks that would otherwise reveal the presence of intruders. Because these natural conditions made observation harder, villagers relied even more on preventative habits like closing doors early. The architecture of medieval houses reflected this emphasis on security. Doors were usually thick pieces of wood, reinforced with simple iron fittings. While not impenetrable, they provided a strong barrier when secured from the inside. Some households also placed heavy objects, like benches or chests near the door, as additional protection. This arrangement meant that anyone attempting to enter would have to make significant noise, giving the occupants time to react. Over generations, the practice of locking doors before sunset became deeply embedded in rural culture. It was not simply a reaction to specific dangers, but a shared understanding passed down through families. Children watched their parents perform the evening routine and eventually learned to do the same when they grew older. In this way, the habit continued across centuries, shaping how communities approached the transition from day to night. As darkness settled fully across the countryside, the village transformed into a quiet cluster of homes illuminated only by faint candlelight behind shutters. Outside, fields stretched silently under the night sky, and distant forests stood like dark walls surrounding the settlement. Within each cottage, families gathered close to the warmth of the hearth, knowing that the door between them and the outside world had been firmly secured. That simple act, pulling the door closed and fastening the bar, represented far more than a daily routine. It was a practical response to the realities of medieval life, where safety depended on preparation, awareness, and cooperation within the household. By locking their doors before sunset, villagers created a small island of security in a world where the night remained vast, mysterious, and often unpredictable. As evening settled across the medieval countryside and the last golden light faded from the sky, the quiet routine of securing the household continued to shape the rhythm of village life. By this time, most villagers had already finished their work for the day, bringing tools back from the fields and gathering the final bundles of firewood or harvested crops. The sounds of daily labor gradually disappeared, replaced by a calm stillness that spread across farms and cottages. For medieval people, this moment between daylight and darkness was significant, because it marked the point when the outside world became far less predictable. Locking the door before sunset was therefore not simply a matter of habit. It was a carefully learned response to generations of experience with the dangers that came after nightfall. An important factor was the limited ability of medieval villagers to respond quickly to emergencies during the night. In modern societies, people can contact neighbors, police, or emergency services almost instantly. Medieval villagers had no such system. If trouble appeared outside a home after dark, the family inside had very few options for assistance. Even if neighbors lived nearby, shouting for help might not reach them through thick walls or across fields. Because communities lacked reliable nighttime communication, every household had to depend primarily on its own precautions. Locking the door early was one of the simplest and most effective ways to reduce risk. Another concern came from the unpredictable movement of soldiers or armed groups travelling through the countryside. During certain periods of medieval history, wars between kingdoms or local lords caused soldiers to pass through rural areas. These soldiers were not always disciplined, and some took advantage of villages by demanding food, shelter, or valuables. Although such events did not occur every night, the possibility was always present in regions affected by conflict. Villagers who heard rumors of troops moving through nearby areas often became even more cautious about closing their homes before sunset. The importance of protecting personal belongings also encouraged families to secure their homes early. Medieval households owned relatively few possessions compared to modern standards, but the items they did have were essential to survival. Tools used for farming, cooking pots, knives, wooden chests, and clothing represented valuable resources that could not easily be replaced. A thief stealing even a single tool could disrupt a family's ability to work the land the next day. Because these possessions were kept inside small homes with limited storage space, protecting the doorway became the main method of safeguarding them. The design of medieval villages often created narrow paths and enclosed spaces between houses. While this layout helped communities stay close together, it also meant that shadows could easily gather in corners or behind buildings once the sun disappeared. Someone walking quietly through these dark passages might approach a house without being noticed until the last moment. Villagers understood this risk, which is why the evening routine included checking the door, fastening the latch, and ensuring that no gaps remained open. Cultural beliefs about night further reinforced the importance of staying indoors. Medieval people often viewed darkness as a time when the natural order of the world felt uncertain. Folklore stories warned about strange creatures, wandering spirits, or mysterious figures travelling through forests after sunset. While these tales were not always taken literally, they shaped the collective imagination of communities. The darkness of the countryside, filled with unfamiliar sounds and shapes, could easily make such stories feel real. Locking the door created a psychological barrier that helped people feel protected from both physical and imagined threats. Another reason, villagers preferred to secure their homes early, was the difficulty of identifying visitors at night. During daylight hours, It was easy to recognize a neighbor or friend approaching from down the road. Faces, clothing, and voices could be clearly observed. At night, however, even a familiar person could appear unfamiliar in dim light. A candle placed near the doorway might illuminate only a small portion of someone's face, leaving the rest hidden in shadow. This uncertainty made villagers cautious about opening their homes once darkness had arrived. Domestic animals living near the house also influenced nighttime habits. Many medieval households kept cats, dogs, or small livestock close to the living space. Cats helped control mice that might otherwise eat stored grain, while dogs acted as guardians that alerted families to unusual sounds. These animals were sensitive to nighttime disturbances and often reacted quickly to movement outside. If a dog began barking repeatedly, villagers might suspect that someone or something was nearby. Having the door already locked ensured that any investigation could be done carefully rather than in panic. The economy of medieval life also meant that people valued rest whenever possible. Farming required intense physical effort, especially during planting and harvesting seasons. Workers spent long hours bending, lifting, and walking across fields. By the time evening arrived, most villagers were exhausted and ready to sleep soon after completing their household tasks. Locking the door before sunset prevented interruptions later in the night, allowing families to recover their energy for the next day's labor. Seasonal changes brought additional challenges that reinforced these habits. During autumn, falling leaves and cooler winds created unfamiliar sounds around homes. In winter, long nights and freezing temperatures made venturing outside uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous. Snow could hide paths and make it difficult to track footprints or identify movement near the house. These conditions encouraged villagers to complete their evening routines earlier and remain indoors until morning. Village traditions sometimes included signals that reminded people of the approaching night. Church bells were often rung in the evening, marking the end of the working day and calling people to prayer. Hearing the bell echo across fields served as a clear sign that the time had come to return home. Families finishing their tasks would hurry back to their cottages, knowing that darkness was only minutes away. Soon afterward, doors throughout the village would close almost simultaneously. Once the doors were secured, the atmosphere inside homes became calm and intimate. The hearth fire flickered softly, casting warm light across wooden beams and earthen floors. Families shared simple meals of bread, vegetables, or stew while discussing the events of the day. Children listened to stories or helped with small tasks like sorting grain or preparing wool for spinning. These peaceful evening moments were made possible by the knowledge that the household was protected from outside disturbances. The contrast between inside and outside spaces during medieval nights was striking. Outside the home lay a vast landscape filled with darkness, cool air, and distant animal sounds. Inside, there was warmth, light, and the presence of family members. The locked door stood between these two worlds, representing safety and stability. Even though the barrier was simple, a wooden plank reinforced with iron, it carried deep meaning for those who depended on it. Over many generations, this routine shaped how medieval villagers understood their environment. The rising and setting of the sun defined the boundaries of daily activity, and the moment of closing the door symbolized the transition from work to rest. It was a small but powerful action repeated thousands of times across villages throughout Europe. When the village finally grew quiet and the last candle was extinguished, the doors remained firmly closed until morning. Behind those doors, families slept, while the night passed slowly across fields and forests. By the time the first light of dawn returned, villagers would open their doors again, step back into the fresh air, and begin another day of work in the same landscapes that had felt so mysterious only hours before. Through this simple daily habit of locking doors before sunset, medieval villagers created a sense of order and protection in a world where darkness still held many uncertainties. It was not only a practical measure, but also a reflection of how communities adapted to their environment, using routine and caution to maintain safety in the quiet, shadowed nights of the medieval countryside. As the glow of the evening sky slowly faded into darkness across the medieval countryside, the final moments of daylight carried a sense of urgency that every villager understood well. These moments were often filled with small but important tasks that needed to be completed before night fully arrived. Buckets were filled with water from the village. Tools were placed safely inside sheds or homes, and the last animals wandering in the yard were guided into their enclosures. Once these final duties were finished, villagers turned their attention to the door of their home. The act of closing and securing it was one of the last actions before settling into the quiet rhythm of the night. For medieval villagers, the door of a house represented more than just an entrance. It was the primary line of defense separating the safety of the household from the uncertainties of the outside world. Unlike modern homes with multiple layers of security, alarms, and reinforced materials, medieval cottages relied on simple construction. The walls might be made of timber frames, filled with woven branches and mud, or rough stones bound with clay. Windows were small openings, covered with wooden shutters or cloth. As the last faint colours of sunset disappeared from the horizon, medieval villages entered a period of deep stillness that modern people rarely experience. The quiet that followed was not simply peaceful. It carried a certain weight, a feeling that the world outside the door had become vast and uncertain. The fields that only hours earlier were filled with workers and animals now lay empty and shadowed. Dirt paths that connected homes to the well, the church, and the farmland faded into darkness. In this environment, the simple act of closing and locking the door took on an importance that reached beyond ordinary caution. It represented preparation for a night where the household would rely entirely on its own walls for protection. One of the reasons villagers felt this need so strongly was the unpredictability of rural travel after sunset. During the day, people travelling along roads could be seen from a distance, and their intentions were easier to judge. At night, however, a traveller might appear suddenly near a house without warning. Because visibility was so limited, villagers could not easily determine whether such a person was a harmless wanderer or someone with harmful intentions. This uncertainty encouraged families to avoid contact with strangers once darkness began approaching. Locking the door before sunset meant that if someone arrived late, the household would already be secure. The geography surrounding many medieval villages made nighttime movement even more unsettling. Settlements were often built near forests or hills, because those environments provided wood, water sources, and protection from strong winds. Yet these same features created natural barriers that blocked visibility. At night, The edges of forests appeared like dark walls, hiding whatever might be moving within them. Villagers sometimes heard branches breaking or animals moving through the undergrowth, but they could not see what caused the sounds. Because they could not identify these movements clearly, people preferred to observe the night from the safety of indoors. The relationship between humans and animals in medieval life also influenced the habit of securing doors early. Villagers depended heavily on livestock, which were often kept close to the home. Chickens, goats, pigs, and sometimes even sheep might be housed in attached structures or nearby sheds. These animals were valuable assets, providing food and income. Predators searching for easy prey sometimes approached villages quietly during the night, drawn by the smell and sounds of livestock. Wolves were particularly feared in certain regions, especially during harsh winters when food was scarce. Although wolves rarely attacked people directly, they could easily kill smaller animals. Locking doors and ensuring that animal enclosures were secure helped protect these essential resources. The emotional atmosphere inside homes changed noticeably once evening. Security was complete. During daylight hours, people were constantly moving between indoor and outdoor spaces. Doors opened frequently as family members came and went, bringing in tools, water, or harvested crops. But once the door was closed for the night, the household became a contained environment. The outside world faded into silence, and attention shifted entirely to the activities happening around the hearth. This sense of enclosure created a strong feeling of family unity. Parents and children gathered close together, sharing warmth and light from the fire. Conversations were often quieter and more reflective than the busy exchanges that occurred during the day. People discussed the weather, the condition of crops, and the plans for upcoming work. Because evenings were one of the few times when the entire household could relax together, these moments carried special meaning. The limitations of medieval lighting further encouraged people to remain indoors after sunset. Candles were expensive and sometimes difficult to obtain, especially for poorer families. Oil lamps provided light, but could produce smoke and required careful attention to prevent accidents. As a result, villagers tried to complete tasks requiring strong light before darkness arrived. Once night settled in, only essential activities continued, and most households reduced their use of light to conserve resources. Another subtle reason villagers locked their doors before sunset involved the way human senses adapt to darkness. When a person moves suddenly from a bright environment into darkness, it takes time for the eyes to adjust. Medieval villagers knew that stepping outside into pitch darkness could leave them temporarily unable to see clearly. This moment of blindness could be dangerous if someone or something was nearby. By staying indoors after the door was secured, people avoided placing themselves in situations where their senses were limited. Community awareness also played a role in maintaining these habits. In small villages, unusual activity at night quickly attracted attention. If someone walked through the village paths after sunset, dogs might bark and neighbors might look through small shutters to see who was moving outside. Because everyone recognized that nighttime movement could signal trouble, villagers preferred not to create unnecessary suspicion by wandering around after dark. Closing doors early helped maintain the quiet order expected within the community. Seasonal agricultural cycles influenced these behaviors as well. During busy harvest periods, villagers worked long hours in the fields from sunrise until late afternoon. By the time evening approached, people were physically exhausted. The routine of closing the door and settling indoors marked the end of a demanding day of labor. It provided a clear transition from work to rest, allowing bodies and minds to recover before the next morning's responsibilities. In addition to practical concerns, medieval villagers often viewed the night as a time when the boundaries between the natural and spiritual worlds felt thinner. Religious beliefs and local folklore blended together to create an atmosphere of caution regarding nighttime activities. Stories told around hearth fires sometimes described mysterious figures seen near crossroads or strange lights appearing in distant fields. Whether taken literally or symbolically, such stories encouraged people to respect the night and avoid unnecessary risks outside their homes. Weather patterns could also intensify the feeling of isolation once darkness arrived. Fog sometimes rolled across valleys and fields during the evening, reducing visibility even further. Strong winds rattled wooden shutters and made trees sway, producing eerie sounds that echoed across the landscape. During heavy storms, thunder and rain could drown out other noises, making it difficult to hear approaching footsteps or animal movements. In such conditions, the security of a locked door provided comfort and reassurance. The simplicity of medieval door mechanisms meant that households often relied on physical strength rather than complex technology. A thick wooden beam placed across the door from the inside was one of the most common methods of securing it. While basic, this method was effective because anyone attempting to force the door would create enough noise to alert the family inside. Knowing this allowed villagers to sleep more peacefully during the night. Throughout the medieval world, these nightly routines formed part of a broader rhythm connecting human life to the movement of the sun. Dawn signaled the beginning of activity, while sunset marked the moment when caution replaced openness. Doors that stood wide during the day gradually closed as shadows lengthened across the land. By the time full darkness covered the village, the transformation was complete. Houses stood quietly along narrow paths, their doors firmly secured. Only faint glimmers of firelight escaped through small shutters, suggesting the presence of life within. Outside, fields and forests stretched silently under the stars, inhabited by creatures that thrived in the night. Inside those cottages, families rested behind their locked doors, trusting in the routine that generations before them had practiced. The door, simple though it was, symbolized safety, preparation, and the quiet determination of medieval villagers to protect their homes until the first light of morning returned to the countryside once again. As the night deepened across the medieval countryside, the silence that surrounded villages became even more noticeable. Once the last door had been closed and secured, the settlement seemed to withdraw into itself, as if each home had become a small island of warmth and safety in a vast ocean of darkness. The open fields that surrounded the village now lay hidden under the night sky, and the narrow dirt paths that connected homes to the outside world disappeared into shadows. In this environment, villagers relied heavily on the routines they had developed over generations, and one of the most important of these routines was the act of locking the door before sunset. The habit was strengthened by the way medieval people experienced distance and isolation. Even though villages were communities, the countryside itself was enormous and largely empty once darkness arrived. A traveller standing just a short distance beyond the edge of a village might see nothing but silhouettes of trees and faint shapes of rooftops against the sky. From that distance, it would be difficult to tell how many people lived there or whether anyone was awake inside. Because villages were small and scattered across wide landscapes, the feeling of being alone in the dark countryside was very real. Locking the door early allowed villagers to create a boundary that separated their protected domestic world from the wide unknown spaces outside. As darkness continued to settle across the medieval countryside, the quietness surrounding villages became deeper and more complete. Once every household had closed its door, and the final movements of the evening had faded away, the village seemed almost suspended in time. The flickering glow of hearth fires behind wooden shutters was often the only visible sign of life. Outside those walls stretched a landscape that looked very different from how it appeared during the day. Fields that were bright and familiar under the sun became dark expanses where shapes blended into shadows, and the narrow paths connecting farms and cottages disappeared into the night. In such conditions, medieval villagers understood that the safest place to be was inside their homes, behind a firmly secured door. The tradition of locking doors before sunset was also shaped by the way medieval people understood responsibility within the household. In most families, the head of the household, often the father or eldest adult, was responsible for ensuring that the home was safe before the night began. This included checking that tools were stored properly, animals were secured, and the door was firmly closed. Completing these tasks was considered an important duty, similar to preparing food or tending the fields. When the door was finally fastened with its wooden bar or iron latch, it symbolized that the household had done everything possible to prepare for the night ahead. The countryside itself was a place where sounds carried great distances, especially after sunset. Without the noise of daily work, even faint sounds could travel far across open land. The distant call of a night bird, the rustle of wind through dry grass, or the movement of animals in nearby woods might echo across the quiet landscape. These sounds reminded villagers that the world outside their homes continued to move even while they rested. Although most of these noises were harmless, they reinforced the sense that night belonged to forces and creatures that were difficult to observe or predict. Another reason villagers preferred to close their doors early was the limited visibility provided by moonlight. While a full moon could illuminate the countryside to some degree, many nights were darker due to clouds or the natural lunar cycle. On such nights, the darkness could be so complete that walking outside became disorienting. Even experienced farmers who knew the land well could struggle to recognize familiar paths when visibility dropped. This difficulty increased the chances of accidents, such as falling into shallow ditches, stumbling over stones, or wandering into areas where animals might be present. Inside the house, the door served not only as protection, but also as insulation against the outside environment. Medieval homes were not built with modern insulation materials, so maintaining warmth was an important concern, especially in cooler climates. When the door remained open or loosely closed, cold air could easily enter the living space. By securing the door tightly before sunset, villagers preserved the warmth generated by the hearth fire. This warmth was essential during long nights, particularly in winter months when temperatures dropped significantly. Even the design of village streets and pathways contributed to the sense of caution surrounding nighttime movement. Many medieval villages developed gradually over time rather than through organized planning. As a result, paths between houses could be narrow, uneven, or winding. During daylight, these paths were easy to navigate, but in darkness they became confusing. A person walking through the village after sunset might struggle to see where one path ended and another began. Because of this, villagers preferred to avoid unnecessary travel after the door had been locked for the night. The social expectations within a village also supported this routine. People respected the privacy of households once evening arrived. Knocking on someone's door late at night was considered unusual, unless there was an urgent reason, because everyone followed the same schedule of returning home before sunset. Villagers rarely expected visitors after dark. This shared understanding helped create a peaceful nighttime environment where each family could rest without worrying about interruptions. Within the household, evenings were often a time for reflection and quiet conversation. Without the distractions of modern entertainment, families relied on simple activities to pass the time before sleep. Some might review the events of the day, discussing how the crops were growing or whether the weather seemed likely to change. Others might plan the tasks that needed to be completed the following morning. These conversations strengthened family cooperation, ensuring that everyone understood their responsibilities for the next day's work. For children growing up in medieval villages, the nightly routine of closing the door carried important lessons about safety and awareness. Watching their parents secure the door each evening taught them that the outside world required respect and caution. As they grew older and began helping with household tasks, children might be given the responsibility of checking the latch or ensuring that shutters were closed properly. In this way, the habit of securing the home was passed down naturally from one generation to the next. The natural environment also influenced how villagers thought about the boundary between indoors and outdoors. During daylight hours, people worked directly within nature, planting crops, tending animals, and gathering firewood from nearby forests. But once night arrived, that same environment felt less familiar. Darkness transformed ordinary places into uncertain spaces where visibility was limited, and sounds were harder to interpret. The closed door created a clear boundary between the human world of the household and the unpredictable environment beyond it. During particularly cold or stormy nights, the sense of security provided by a locked door became even more meaningful. Strong winds could shake wooden walls and cause roofs to creak loudly. Rain might fall heavily against the thatch or stone, and thunder sometimes echoed across valleys. In such moments, families gathered close to the hearth, grateful for the shelter their homes provided. Knowing that the door was firmly secured helped them feel protected against both human and natural threats. The rhythm of medieval life meant that nights were often long and quiet, especially during winter when darkness arrived early and lasted until late morning. Villagers depended on these long periods of rest to recover from physically demanding work. Farming required strength and endurance, and adequate sleep was essential for maintaining health. Locking the door before sunset helped ensure that the night would pass without disturbances that might interrupt this important rest. When dawn finally approached and the first pale light appeared on the horizon, the atmosphere of the village slowly changed again. Roosters crowed. Smoke began rising from chimneys as fires were rekindled, and doors that had been closed throughout the night were opened once more. Fresh air filled the houses, and villagers stepped outside to begin another day of work. Looking back at this daily cycle, it becomes clear why locking doors before sunset was such an important practice in medieval villages. It was not only a response to potential danger, but also a reflection of how people adapted to the rhythms of nature, the limitations of their environment, and the need to protect their families and livelihoods. The simple wooden door stood as the boundary between the quiet security of home and the vast, uncertain world that stretched across the dark countryside. Through generations of experience, medieval villagers learned that preparation before nightfall was one of the best ways to ensure safety. By closing and securing their doors while the last light of the sun still remained, they created a small but reliable defense against the many uncertainties that came with the medieval night. As night fully settled across the medieval countryside and the sky filled with stars, the village existed in a state of quiet stillness that was deeply familiar to those who lived there. The transformation from the busy energy of daytime to the calm silence of night was gradual but unmistakable. One by one, the doors of cottages had been closed, shutters drawn over small windows, and wooden bars placed securely across door frames. This simple act marked the end of daily activity and the beginning of a protected period of rest. For medieval villagers, locking the door before sunset was not only about preventing danger, it was part of a rhythm that helped them adapt to a world shaped by nature, darkness, and uncertainty. In the countryside of the medieval period, darkness was far more powerful than it is today. Without artificial lighting spread across towns and roads, night created an almost complete absence of visibility. When the moon was hidden behind clouds, the landscape could become so dark that even familiar landmarks were difficult to see. A path that had been walked hundreds of times during daylight might appear completely different in darkness. Villagers knew that the safest way to avoid the risks of such conditions was simply to remain indoors once evening approached. Locking the door early made it easier to commit to that decision and prevented unnecessary movement outside. The surrounding environment also played an important role in shaping these habits. Medieval villages were often located in areas chosen for practical reasons, such as fertile soil, access to water, and proximity to forests that provided timber and fuel. While these features were valuable during the day, they could create a sense of isolation at night. Forest edges appeared as dark silhouette. As the deep hours of night stretched across the medieval countryside, the quiet behind the closed doors of village homes became almost complete. Inside each cottage, the fire burned softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across wooden beams and earthen floors. Families slept or rested, trusting that the simple precautions taken earlier in the evening would protect them until morning. Outside those doors, however, the world felt very different. The countryside at night was vast, dark, and unpredictable. And this contrast between the warmth of the home and the uncertainty of the outside world was one of the main reasons medieval villagers developed the habit of locking their doors before sunset. During the medieval period, villages were small communities scattered across large rural landscapes. Many of these settlements consisted of only a few dozen homes surrounded by farmland. Beyond the cultivated fields were forests, hills, rivers, and open land that stretched for miles. In daylight, these areas were familiar parts of daily life where people gathered firewood, hunted animals, or traveled to neighboring settlements. But once night arrived, these same landscapes became places where visibility was limited and movement was difficult to detect. Villagers understood that darkness could hide both animals and humans, and because of this, they preferred to prepare for the night before it fully arrived. Another important reason for locking doors early was the uncertainty surrounding travellers. Roads during the medieval era were often rough dirt paths used by merchants, messengers, pilgrims, and wandering workers. Many travellers were peaceful and simply moving between towns. However, the same roads were sometimes used by criminals or desperate individuals searching for food and shelter. When the sun was still visible, villagers could watch travellers approach and judge their behaviour. But at night it became nearly impossible to know who might be outside the door. Locking the door before sunset allowed households to avoid these uncertain situations entirely. The architecture of medieval homes also encouraged early security. Most cottages were simple structures made from materials available in the local environment. Wooden frames filled with woven branches and clay were common in many areas, while some homes used rough stones stacked together to form walls. These buildings were strong enough to provide shelter from weather, but they were not designed to withstand serious attacks. Because of this, preventing entry in the first place was the most effective form of protection. Securing the door before darkness ensured that the household would not be caught unprepared if someone attempted to enter. In addition to human threats, the natural world posed its own challenges during the night. Forest animals were more active after sunset, and villagers often heard them moving through nearby woods. Wolves, foxes, and wild boars sometimes approached farms searching for food. Livestock kept near houses could attract these animals, especially during winter months when food in the wild was scarce. By locking doors and securing animal pens before darkness arrived, villagers reduced the chances that predators would reach their animals or wander into living spaces. Inside the home, the evening atmosphere was shaped by the limited light available. Candles were expensive and often made from animal fat or beeswax, which required careful preparation. Because these resources were valuable, families tried to use them sparingly. Most homes relied heavily on the glow of the hearth fire for illumination. This soft, flickering light was enough for conversation and simple tasks, but not suitable for complex work. As a result, evenings were naturally quieter and slower than the busy hours of daytime. The closed door played an important role in creating this peaceful indoor environment. It blocked cold winds, reduced outside noise, and maintained the warmth generated by the fire. For families who spent long days working outdoors, stepping into a warm enclosed space at the end of the day was deeply comforting. The moment when the door was secured often marked the official end of work and the beginning of rest. Village culture also encouraged people to respect the boundary between day and night. During daylight hours, social life flourished. Neighbors visited one another, children played in open spaces, and farmers worked together during busy seasons like planting and harvest. But once the sun began to set, activity gradually slowed. People returned to their homes, knowing that nighttime was meant for rest rather than travel or social visits. Locking doors before sunset reinforced this cultural understanding and helped maintain order within the community. For children growing up in medieval households, these routines were an important part of learning about responsibility and safety. They watched adults carefully close shutters, check the latch on the door, and ensure that the home was ready for the night. Over time, these actions became familiar habits. By participating in small tasks like bringing in firewood or helping secure animals, children gradually learned how to contribute to the safety of the household. Religious beliefs also influenced how villagers approached the night. Many families ended the day with evening prayers, asking for protection and guidance until morning. The act of closing the door often took place just before or after these prayers. In this way, the physical act of securing the home was connected to a spiritual sense of trust and gratitude. People believed that both their own actions and divine protection worked together to keep their families safe. Seasonal changes made the nightly routine even more important at certain times of the year. During winter, darkness arrived early and lasted for many hours. Snow, frost, and cold winds created harsh conditions outside, making travel difficult and sometimes dangerous. By locking doors before sunset, villagers ensured that their homes remained warm and secure throughout the long winter nights. The silence that followed once the entire village had settled for the night could be striking. Without modern machines or electric lights, the countryside became incredibly still. Occasionally, a dog barked in response to a distant sound, or the wind rustled through trees near the edge of the fields. But for the most part, the village remained quiet until morning. Within this silence, each household rested behind its closed door. Families slept near the fading warmth of the hearth, confident that the simple routines practiced every evening had prepared them for the night ahead. The door, secured before the sun had fully disappeared, stood as the final barrier between the safe domestic world of the home and the vast darkness outside. When dawn finally arrived and the sky slowly brightened, the village came back to life. Roosters crowed, farmers stepped outside to check animals, and doors that had remained closed all night opened once again. The cycle of daily life resumed, repeating the same rhythm that medieval communities had followed for generations. Through this repeated pattern of closing doors before sunset and opening them again with the sunrise, medieval villagers created a practical system for living safely in a world where darkness brought real uncertainty. The habit may seem simple today, but in the medieval countryside it was one of the most reliable ways to protect families, preserve peace within the household, and ensure that the long hours of night could pass quietly until morning returned. As the deepest hours of night settled over the medieval countryside, the quiet around villages became almost absolute, with doors locked and shutters closed. Homes stood like small islands of warmth and light in a sea of darkness. The simple wooden door that separated the interior of the house from the outside world was one of the most important features of a medieval home. It represented safety, preparation, and the understanding that once darkness arrived, the outside world could not always be trusted. For villagers who had lived their entire lives in rural environments, this nightly habit of locking doors before sunset was not simply a precaution. It was part of the rhythm of survival. During the medieval period, villages were usually surrounded by land that belonged to local farmers. These fields stretched outward from the settlement in all directions, gradually blending into forests, hills, rivers, or marshes. In daylight, these landscapes were full of activity and purpose. Farmers worked their crops, shepherds guided animals through pastures, and travelers followed dirt roads that connected distant communities. But once the sun sank below the horizon, the same landscapes changed dramatically. Without sunlight, the countryside became a place where shapes blurred together, and familiar paths became difficult to see. Villagers knew that darkness could hide both harmless movement and potential threats. Zone of the reasons people locked their doors before sunset was the difficulty of identifying strangers at night. In a small village, most residents knew one another by face, voice, and clothing. If someone unfamiliar appeared during daylight hours, villagers could observe the person's behavior and decide whether to offer help or remain cautious. But in the dim glow of candlelight, recognizing a person became far more difficult. A visitor standing outside the door might appear only as a shadow or silhouette. Because it was impossible to see clearly, villagers preferred to avoid such situations entirely by securing their homes before darkness fell. Another factor was the importance of protecting household resources. Medieval families relied heavily on what they produced themselves: food, tools, clothing, and stored grain represented months of labor and careful preparation. As the final hours of the night passed in the medieval countryside, the silence that surrounded villages remained deep and uninterrupted. Behind their closed doors, families rested while the outside world moved quietly through darkness. The fields that had been full of activity during the day now lay still beneath the stars, and the narrow dirt roads that connected villages stretched empty across the land. In this quiet environment, the simple wooden doors of medieval homes continued to serve as the final barrier between the safety of the household and the uncertainty of the night. The habit of locking these doors before sunset had developed over generations of experience, shaped by the realities of rural life where preparation and caution were essential for survival. For medieval villagers, the end of daylight marked a clear shift in how the world functioned. During the day, people relied heavily on sight to navigate their environment. Farmers could see the boundaries of their land, recognize neighbors from a distance, and observe travelers approaching along the road. But when the sun disappeared, those advantages vanished quickly. Darkness reduced visibility so dramatically that even familiar places could become confusing. A field that looked open and welcoming during daylight might appear mysterious and unsettling at night. Because of this dramatic change, villagers preferred to finish their outdoor activities before sunset and prepare their homes for the long hours of darkness. Locking the door early also reflected the importance of self-reliance in medieval communities. Unlike modern towns with organized law enforcement or emergency services, rural villages often depended on the cooperation of neighbors for protection. If trouble occurred during the night, help might take time to arrive, especially if homes were separated by fields or small woodlands. Securing the door before darkness ensured that each household had taken the necessary steps to protect itself. Another factor that reinforced this habit was the unpredictability of the countryside after sunset. Nighttime could bring sudden weather changes, unfamiliar sounds, or wandering animals. The rustling of leaves in nearby trees, the distant cry of a bird, or the movement of animals in tall grass could all create uncertainty. While many of these sounds were harmless, they reminded villagers that the environment around them was active, even when they could not see clearly. Being inside a secured home allowed people to listen calmly rather than react with fear. Inside the house, the evening routine often provided a sense of peace after the demanding work of the day. Farming required long hours of physical labor, and by the time evening arrived, most villagers were tired. The hearth fire became the center of family life during these hours, providing warmth and a soft glow of light. Families gathered around the fire to eat simple meals, talk about the events of the day, and prepare for the next morning's tasks. The door, firmly secured, created a boundary that allowed these moments to unfold without disturbance. It kept the warmth of the hearth inside while preventing cold air or strong winds from entering. During colder seasons, this warmth was extremely important. Medieval homes had limited insulation, and maintaining a comfortable temperature during the night required careful control of airflow. A closed door helped preserve the heat produced by the fire and kept the interior environment stable. Village traditions also supported the idea that nighttime should be quiet and orderly. Because everyone followed similar daily schedules, most households prepared for bed soon after darkness fell. It was generally understood that visiting neighbors late at night was unusual unless there was an emergency. This shared understanding helped create a peaceful atmosphere across the entire settlement. When the doors of homes were closed, the village entered a period of rest that lasted until morning. The presence of livestock near homes made security even more important. Animals such as chickens, goats, and pigs were valuable resources that families depended on for food and income. These animals were usually kept in enclosures or small shelters near the house, so that they could be protected from predators and theft. By locking the door and ensuring that animal pens were secure before sunset, villagers reduced the risk of losing these important resources during the night. Wild animals in the surrounding forests also contributed to the sense of caution. Although most animals avoided human settlements, hunger or curiosity sometimes brought them closer to villages. Wolves, foxes, and other predators occasionally searched for easy prey among livestock. The sounds of these animals moving through nearby woods could be heard during quiet nights, reminding villagers that the wilderness was always close. Even the design of medieval doors reflected their importance in protecting the household. These doors were often thick wooden planks reinforced with iron hinges or simple metal fittings. Some homes used wooden beams placed across the door from the inside as an additional barrier. While these methods were simple compared to modern locks, they were effective in preventing unwanted entry and gave families confidence that their homes were secure. Children growing up in these villages quickly learned the significance of these nightly routines. They watched as adults checked the door latch, closed shutters over windows, and ensured that the house was ready for the night. Participating in these tasks became part of learning responsibility. By helping secure the home, children understood that everyone in the household contributed to the safety of the family. Religion also played a role in shaping the atmosphere of the evening. Many medieval families ended their day with prayers, asking for protection through the night and expressing gratitude for the safety of their home. The act of locking the door often took place around this time, symbolizing both physical preparation and spiritual trust. As the hours passed and the fire in the hearth slowly burned down to glowing embers, the village remained quiet. Occasionally a dog barked at a distant sound, or the wind moved gently through trees near the fields, but for the most part, the settlement slept peacefully behind its closed doors. Beyond the village boundaries, the night landscape continued its own quiet rhythm. Animals moved through forests, streams flowed softly through valleys, and the stars shone brightly in the clear medieval sky. Most villagers rarely witnessed these scenes directly, because they remained indoors, protected by the simple habit of securing their homes before sunset. Eventually, the darkness began to fade as dawn approached. The first pale light appeared in the east, and birds began to stir in the trees. Roosters crowed to signal the arrival of morning. One by one, doors that had remained locked throughout the night were opened again. Fresh air entered the houses, and villagers stepped outside to begin another day of work. This daily cycle, closing doors before sunset and opening them again at dawn, became one of the quiet foundations of medieval life. It reflected a deep understanding of the environment and the importance of preparation. By following this simple routine, villagers created a reliable system that allowed families to live safely in a world where darkness brought real uncertainty. The door, though humble in appearance, stood as a symbol of protection, responsibility, and the enduring wisdom passed down through generations of medieval village life. As the medieval night continued across the countryside, and the village rested in quiet darkness, the meaning of the closed door became even more significant. For the people living in these small settlements, the door was not simply a piece of wood separating indoors from outdoors. It represented a boundary between two very different worlds. Inside the house there was warmth, family, light from the hearth, and a sense of familiarity. Outside there was darkness, distance, and uncertainty. Locking the door before sunset helped establish that boundary clearly, while there was still enough light to complete the task calmly and carefully. The rhythm of medieval life followed the movement of the sun more closely than modern life does today. When daylight faded, activity naturally slowed. Fields that had been full of workers gradually emptied. As farmers returned home along well-worn paths, the sounds of carts rolling across dirt roads and animals moving through the fields slowly disappeared. In many villages, this moment when people returned home was visible from a distance as thin lines of smoke began rising from chimneys where evening fires were being prepared. Soon afterward, doors would begin closing across the village one after another. The countryside surrounding these settlements often played a large role in shaping villagers' sense of caution. Many communities were located near forests that had existed for centuries. These forests provided wood for building and heating, but they also created natural spaces where people rarely travelled at night. Dense trees blocked the little moonlight available, making the forest interior extremely dark. From the village edge, people might hear sounds of branches snapping or leaves moving as animals travelled through the woods. Even if these sounds were harmless, they reminded villagers that the world beyond the village remained active after nightfall, because villages were relatively small. Every household depended on the safety and stability of the others. If one home experienced trouble, it could affect the entire community. For example, a thief stealing food or tools from one house might later attempt the same thing at another.